Number 10. Buzludzha Monument. In 1981, a group of Bulgarian socialists secretly met up with plans to form an organized movement called the Bulgarian Social Democratic Party. The organization paved the way for what would eventually become the Bulgarian Communist Party. Nearly a century later, in 1974, a monument dedicated to that first meeting was built on a remote peak in the central Balkan Mountains. The futuristic-looking structure is known as the Monument House of the Bulgarian Communist Party, or the Buzludzha Monument for short. Highly skilled engineers created a level foundation by blasting away nearly 530,000 cubic feet of rock with TNT. And in doing so, they reduced the mountain's height by 30 feet. The entire project came at an equivalent price to a whopping $35 million in modern funds. It was first opened to the public in 1981, but closed when communism fell just a handful of years later in 1989. When that happened, all maintenance on the building came to a halt. Like many state-sponsored communist buildings, the Buzludzha Monument has a paradoxically space-age-like yet vintage look. It's visibly outdated and slowly decaying, but still has features that were once thought of as the architecture of the future. The monument houses a collection of mosaics commemorating the Bulgarian Communist Party's history. Sadly, some of the artwork has been destroyed by time, nature, and vandals. Visitors are no longer allowed due to safety concerns. Number 9. Vercelli Psychiatric Hospital. Built in the early 1930s, the Vercelli Psychiatric Hospital was one of Italy's largest insane asylums. The sprawling complex occupied nearly 70 acres and consisted of 20 pavilions as well as a small church. The pavilions housed a gymnasium, auditorium, children's area, visitors area, and more. One area, known as the Carlo Forlanini Pavilion, consisted of small rooms which housed the most severely mentally ill patients. They underwent scary and often painful experimental treatments, including electroconvulsive therapy. In 1978, the Bassaglia Law went into effect, requiring the dismantling of Italy's mental hospitals. The Vercelli facility closed in accordance with the law, but a regular hospital continued to operate in some of the pavilions until 1991. An environmental office uses a small part of the property today, but the rest is managed by the local health authority and remains abandoned. French photographer Sylvain Margain gained access to the off-limits buildings in 2015 and snapped fascinating images of the decrepit, dust-covered ruins. Humidity has destroyed the walls, the plaster is crumbling, and thick vegetation has overtaken the once neatly manicured yard. Wheelchairs, books, medical paperwork, psychiatry magazines, and other items are scattered throughout the now dark and silent buildings, serving as an eerie reminder of Western society's controversial history of mental health care. Number 8. Superconducting Supercollider. Nicknamed the Desertron, the Superconducting Supercollider SSC was supposed to be the world's biggest and most energetic particle accelerator. If this vision had ever materialized, the end result would have been a massive structure measuring over 54 miles in circumference. But things didn't go exactly as planned. The project came to an abrupt halt just 2 years after construction began in 1991. By then, over $2 billion had been spent, yet only 14 miles of tunnel had been built. During the planning stages, the structure's total cost had been estimated at around $4.4 billion. Investors began losing confidence in 1993 when projected costs skyrocketed to over $8 billion. A report by the Inspector General from the Department of Energy criticized the Super Collider's officials for poor management and high costs. Eager to see the project through, then-President Bill Clinton tried to stop it from being canceled. But Congress went against his wishes and revoked federal funding, ending the plans for good. The property changed hands several times over the following years, and in the meantime, some of the tunnels were flooded to retain stability while others were locked up and left as is. The site soon became a hotspot for criminals, partygoers, and other trespassers. Today, the property is home to an oil field product manufacturer, and it's strictly off-limits to outsiders. Number 7. Foinikas. Nestled in a valley near the southwestern coast of Cyprus, there's an abandoned village called Foinikas. Today, it sits in ruins, with its stone structures slowly crumbling in what appears to be a losing battle against age and Mother Nature. But once upon a time, the village was bustling and full of activity. Legend has it that the Knights Templar founded Foinikas in the 12th century during the Third Crusade, after King Richard the Lionheart of England invaded the island. It served as the order's administrative center during their rule over Cyprus and went on to play a role in the island's sugar and silk trades. The Ottoman Empire took control of Cyprus in 1571, at which point many of the Templars' records were destroyed. For a long time, Foinikas was inhabited by Turkish Cypriots. But that all changed in 1974 when Turkish forces invaded Cyprus. Greek Cypriots launched a counteroffensive, and the unrest resulted in a clearly delineated boundary across the country, which separates the two ethnic groups to this day. Because Foinikis falls on the Greek side of the island, its inhabitants fled. Following the 1974 coup d'etat, displaced Greek Cypriots resettled in Foinikas. The residents were forced to uproot their lives and move yet again when the government decided to build a dam nearby. Some of the picturesque ghost town's stone buildings remain standing today, but Foinikas is slowly caving to the effects of time and the elements. Number 6. Edinburgh Manor. During the 19th century, county commissioners in Jones County, Iowa decided to use some federal grant money they received to build a county poor farm. Located in Edinburgh, the poor farm was designed as a place for the unemployed and impoverished to go, where they could work in exchange for food and shelter. It was originally described as a comfortable retreat for lazy, able-bodied, and willingly dependent applicants. The poor farm eventually became a catch-all for an array of social problems, including the need for mental health treatment and housing for categories of poor and disabled people. And while it sounds like it was a safe haven for vulnerable people, what went on there was much different in practice than in theory. At least 150 people died at the poor farm in the years it was operating from 1850 to 1910, after which point it was demolished. It was replaced by the 12,000 square foot building that still stands today, known as Edinburgh Manor. The new facility functions similarly to the poor farm, housing both men and women who were down on their luck, as well as the elderly, disabled, and mentally ill. Over time, new social programs were implemented, offering people alternatives to poor houses. By the early 2000s, there were only 20 to 40 people still living at Edinburgh Manor. It was completely abandoned by 2011 when a private company bought the property with plans to turn it into a bed and breakfast. Structural safety concerns stopped that from happening, and Edinburgh Manor remains empty to this day. It's now owned by a couple who are dedicated to preserving its history. They say the building is haunted by the ghosts of crime victims, and visitors seem to agree. Either way, the site is kind of spooky, with medical equipment, furniture, and the personal belongings of past residents serving as a testament to the less fortunate who went to Edinburgh Manor when they had nowhere else to go. Would you dare visit this creepy manor? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 5. Churchill Tunnel. The Churchill Tunnel was built in Richmond, Virginia in 1873 to accommodate train traffic. It became obsolete after operating for just a handful of years and was abandoned in 1902. The local government tried to reclaim the 4,000-foot-long tunnel in 1925, but a large section of it collapsed while it was being worked on as a 10-car locomotive passed through. At least 2 workers died, while another managed to escape and survived. Legend has it that the crew had reawakened an ancient vampire who lived inside the tunnel and who caused it to collapse as revenge for the disruption. Survivors of the tunnel's collapse allegedly discovered the vampire crouched over one of the victims, baring his bloody, jagged teeth. Over the years, several attempts were made to recover the locomotive and the 2 bodies, but sinkholes and additional collapses kept getting in the way. The tunnel was sealed off with sand and concrete. During its operating years, 9 others reportedly died under similar circumstances to the 2 men who were supposedly victimized by the vampire. But supernatural forces may not have been responsible for their deaths after all. As it turns out, the tunnel was built among clay and soft sandstone, making it unstable and dangerous from day one. Number 4. Yaniv Railway Station. The Yaniv Railway Station was built during the 1920s on the outskirts of Pripyat, Ukraine, where the infamous Chernobyl nuclear disaster happened in 1986. In fact, it played a vital role in the construction of the ill-fated power plant and the housing that was built for the thousands of employees who worked there. Yaniv functioned as a main station for both passengers and freight traveling in and out of the industrial city. Unfortunately, the station was included in the exclusion zone that was created after the disaster and fell into disuse. One track has been rebuilt since then. It was used for hauling supplies in and out of Pripyat during the construction of the new safe confinement, a structure that was built to contain the remains of the destroyed nuclear reactor that spewed deadly radiation into the air on that fateful day 35 years ago. It's strange to think that the disaster really wasn't that long ago, was it? Today, the station isn't much more than a series of rotting tracks and a train graveyard that sit alongside a disused water tower and a collection of abandoned military vehicles. There was once a nearby village that 254 residents called home, but they were evacuated and their houses demolished. Truck drivers have reportedly repurposed some of the old train cars as a place to sleep while they're working in the area, while scrap merchants occupy the main station. These areas have been cleaned up, but the military vehicles remain contaminated and the site is in visible disrepair. It's highly unlikely that the Yaniv railway station will ever be restored to its former glory. Number 3. Thessaloniki Train Cemetery. There's an ever-expanding graveyard of decommissioned trains that sits outside Greece's second-largest city, Thessaloniki. The rail cars were left behind by the country's national rail company, known as the Hellenic Railways Organization, starting in the 1980s. Today, there are over 1,000 abandoned rail cars at the site, serving no purpose other than as an attraction for urban explorers. Attempts to legitimately sell the cars as scrap were unsuccessful. Not many honest business owners seem interested in doing business with the site, which has a reputation for scrap smuggling and shady dealings. Some will argue that not all the trains are worth scrapping anyway. The yard contains some remarkable vintage cars, including antique wagons dating back to 1895, which once traveled between Thessaloniki and Istanbul. While visiting the site, photographer Nikki Panu spotted train cars that the Nazis seized as trophies during World War II. She wrote on her website that it's sad that nobody cared to preserve the old trains and that they've been left unguarded for vandals to dismantle and sell for scrap. It amounts to a lot of lost heritage and is a sad story indeed. Number 2. Little America Post Office. The first U.S. post office in Antarctica was established in October 1933 at a base camp on the Ross Ice Shelf known as Little America. By then, the settlement had been around for 5 years, and it even had its own newspaper. It was just one of 5 Little Americas that sprang up in the area over time, but it was arguably the most iconic. A postal worker named Charles Anderson was tasked with running the day-to-day operations at Little America's post office. But in the long run, his job was more symbolic than functional. This is going to sound hard to believe, but the post office was established as an excuse to create a commemorative stamp collection and cancellation mark for stamp collecting enthusiasts. Do you even know anyone that collects stamps? As frivolous as it may seem, the endeavor was wildly successful. People eagerly paid the extra 50 cents it cost for the 3-cent Bird Antarctic Expedition stamp. Altogether, somewhere between 150,000 and 240,000 letters were marked. The Little America Post Office closed in 1935 after serving its short-lived purpose, and the surrounding bases were also eventually abandoned. What became of all the bases is unclear, but it's known that the post office was lost when an iceberg calved and drifted away from the Ross Ice Shelf. Number 1. The English Pier. The town of Almeria in southern Spain is home to a former railway pier that juts right out into the water along a beach called Playa de las Almadrabillas. Known as the Cable Inglés, or the English Pier, it once functioned as a loading bay for nearby iron ore, copper, and silver mines. Scottish engineers designed and built the 3,280-foot-long iron, steel, and concrete structure in 1904. It operated until 1973, facilitating the transport of minerals from Almeria's train station to waiting cargo ships. Once loaded, the vessels carried the goods to northern Spain and elsewhere. The English Pier's ingenious design made it possible for trains to pull right up to the end of the pier and offload their cargo onto a ship. This direct transfer of supplies drastically cut the time it took to load a ship from 8 to 10 days to just 10 hours. The pier is a cherished symbol of Spain's industrial heritage. It still stands today, but is corroding heavily from over a century of exposure to the salty air and water. Thanks for watching. Which one of these abandoned places would you like to check out the most? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.